There's another problem with even a perfect meritocracy, which is that meritocracy has a dark side. The dark side is that it's corrosive of the common good. And the reason it's corrosive of the common good is that it encourages it encourages hubris among the winners and humiliation among those who lose out. It encourages the winners to inhale too deeply of their own success, to forget the luck and good fortune that helped them on their way, to forget our indebtedness to those who make our achievements possible.
Hi, everyone. Good evening. I'm Frédéric Rigoulot, and I'm here to read to you the land acknowledgement of GBH. GBH honors the Massachusetts, Wampanoag, and Nipmuc peoples, whose ancestral lands provide the foundation for GBH's Massachusetts studios, bureaus, and transmitter. We honor the cultures, contributions, and connections of Native Indigenous peoples to our work, our local community, our Commonwealth, and our nation. Further, we recognize the importance of moving beyond acknowledgement towards action. We commit to learning from, including, and elevating Native Indigenous peoples' perspectives, voices, and languages, locally and nationally, through our public media mission. Thank you. And please now welcome Susan Goldberg, President and CEO of GBH.
Thank you, Frederick. Good evening, everyone. I'm Susan Goldberg. I'm the President and CEO of GBH, and we are gathered here tonight to honor our legendary founder, Ralph Lowell, and continue his legacy of community service by launching the Ralph Lowell Annual Lecture at GBH. As we've just seen in the last several weeks, fundamental freedoms about our democracy are under attack, and we have to fight for them. GBH stands for the First Amendment, all 5 freedoms, but especially the rights to freedom of speech and freedom of the press. These freedoms were championed by Ralph Lowell and are at their core what we do and are the bedrock principles upon which we were founded 75 years ago. I look forward very much to hearing from our speaker, Michael Sandel, on how we can move forward as a nation beyond division toward a more civil discourse. I am so pleased that tonight our first lecture is in partnership with our friends at the John F. Kennedy Library Foundation. In 1958, when he was still a senator, John Kennedy wrote a letter to Ralph Lowell that said, "I have been delighted with the type of programming which Channel 2 has delivered. It clearly adds a specific dimension to television in the Boston region and is carrying forward new kinds of experimental and permanent programs." Given that start, it's really no surprise that GBH and the Kennedy Library have been collaborating for decades. Let me please welcome Rachel Floor, Executive Director of the JFK Library Foundation, to say a few words.
Good evening. Thank you, Susan, and your team at GBH for all you're doing in these extraordinary times. The JFK Library Foundation is here tonight as a proud grantee of the Lowell Institute and longtime collaborator of GBH. The Lowell Institute has supported the JFK Library's free public forum series since 1984, the year the Kennedy Library Foundation was established. But as Susan noted, our connection to Ralph Lowell and GBH goes back to President Kennedy himself. Like Ralph Lowell, JFK was a champion of public media and saw free access to education as critical to a thriving democracy. In 1961, 6 years before the Corporation for Public Broadcasting was created, the general manager of WGBH wrote to the White House on behalf of the Lowell Institute Broadcasting Council to update President Kennedy on their plans to form an educational radio network. Later that month, President Kennedy responded with a telegram congratulating them and noting that our system relies on the free communication of facts and is strengthened immeasurably by public interest in fact and knowledge. The next year, President Kennedy signed the Educational Television Act to support construction and upgrades to educational television facilities throughout the country. It was the first big public investment in educational media, and when he signed it, he said, "This act gives the promise of bringing greater opportunities for personal and cultural growth to every American. At a time when the wide availability of quality education is vital to our national growth and security, we must make effective use of all of our educational resources." Today, access to free, quality adult education is more important than ever. For nearly 4 decades, thanks to the support of Bill Lowell and the Lowell Institute, the Kennedy Library has carried on this legacy by providing free public access to some of the most important and interesting voices of our times. We are so proud to open our doors for anyone in the community to come to the JFK Library to learn from heads of state and Supreme Court justices, members of Congress and members of the media, historians, academics, astronauts, artists, activists, entrepreneurs, and even an occasional musician. And thanks to our partners, the only barrier to entry is rush hour traffic on the expressway. This is the Ralph Lowell tradition that we are honored to be part of along with our fellow Lowell grantees. And we are grateful for the opportunity to celebrate him tonight with GBH, the Lowell family, and all of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel, and thank you so much for your partnership. You know, Ralph Lowell was an extraordinary man. I learned in preparing for tonight so many interesting things about him. He refused to fly. He never learned to drive. He walked to his appointments. He bristled at long-windedness, but was known to be warm, understanding, and funny. I would have loved to have been his friend. And he had a vision that educational instruction should be accessible, broadcast free, and available to all. This singular notion resulted in the formation of GBH in 1951 and ultimately of PBS in 1969. We recently found one of the original pens that President Johnson used to sign the Public Broadcasting Act of 1967. The pen had been given to Ralph. Ralph's wife, Charlotte, gave the pen to GBH when she found it in his desk after he died in 1978. Ralph Lowell's life of service for the common good inspires us every day at GBH, and I'm sure it inspires everyone in this room tonight. I'd like to thank the Lowell Institute and all the many members of the Lowell family for being here, and express my deep gratitude for their unwavering support. In particular, I'd like to acknowledge Bill Lowell, Ralph's grandson, a GBH trustee, and the person who really sparked this new annual lecture. Please join me in welcoming Bill Lowell to the stage to say a few words and introduce tonight's speaker.
Good evening. In 1836, John Lowell sat on the banks of the Nile River. He had traveled there from Boston after his wife and 2 children died in a scarlet fever epidemic. In poor health himself, he wrote his will, in which he left half of his estate to fund the Lowell Institute. He stated, quote, "The prosperity of my native land, New England, which is sterile and unproductive, must depend upon the intelligence and information of its inhabitants." Therefore, he created the Lowell Institute with a mission to support free public lectures and educational programs for the citizens of Boston. You might ask, what does any of this have to do with Ralph Lowell or GBH? Well, in the 1940s, my grandfather, Ralph Lowell, used funds from the Lowell Institute to establish the Lowell Institute Cooperative Broadcasting Council and WGBH. He wanted to use the new mediums of radio and later television to advance the mission of the Lowell Institute
to provide free public educational programming to our community. Today, GBH is the preeminent public media organization in the country, and I know how proud my grandfather would be of what it has become. And the free public lecture is alive and well in the city of Boston. The GBH Forum Network, funded by the Lowell Institute, has posted over 4,300 talks and lectures online that can be viewed by anyone at any time for free. And more than 28 million people have done so to date. It's wonderful to have representatives of so many organizations, like the Kennedy Library, here tonight, which have partnered with the Lowell Institute and GBH Forum to present these programs. Now, my grandfather did not see himself merely as a philanthropist. He saw himself as a steward of the Lowell Institute's legacy of dedication to the maintenance and support of free public lectures and courses for the citizens of Boston, regardless of race or gender. It is that spirit of service to the community that lives on here at GBH. We all know that this is a perilous time in our democracy. Political violence continues to rise. We are more polarized than ever. We need to talk across political lines and restore civil discourse in our country. We need to accept that it's okay to disagree. And as Susan said, we need to protect the fundamental rights of free speech and free press. So we are grateful to have Michael Sandel here to kick us off tonight to talk about his book, Democracy's Discontent, Why We Are So Polarized and What We Can Do About It. The lecture will draw upon themes from his book, which explores the historical, political, and economic sources of the peril that democracy faces today. Michael Sandel teaches political philosophy at Harvard University. His books on justice, democracy, meritocracy, and markets have been translated into more than 30 languages. He has been described by Newsweek as a rock star moralist, and by the New Statesman as the world's most influential living philosopher. A new edition of Democracy's Discontent is available here tonight, thanks to the Harvard Bookstore. So you can get your copy signed. And the book has been described as essential and ultimately hopeful reading for all those who wonder if our democratic experiment will survive in the 21st century. In 2009, Professor Sandel's legendary course, Justice, was the first Harvard course made freely available online and on television. GBH2 carried it, and it has since been viewed by tens of millions of people. Please join me in welcoming Michael Sandel to the podium for our first annual Ralph Lowell Lecture.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Susan Goldberg. Thank you, Bill Lowell, for that generous introduction. And also, thanks to you for gathering here in celebration of Ralph Lowell and his legacy of public education and public broadcasting. I consider that I have a certain debt to Ralph Lowell because, as Bill just mentioned, in 2009, with the support of GBH, we filmed my Harvard Justice course, made it freely available on public television and online. We never imagined. It was an experiment. We didn't imagine that tens of millions of people would want to watch lectures about philosophy. But that's what happened. And the idea was really to undertake an experiment to open access to the Harvard classroom, especially to a course to do with moral and civic reasoning and argument to show, this was the main idea, to show that higher education, especially on moral and political argument and reasoning, is not just a private privilege, but a public good. That was our goal. And thanks to GBH and to the tradition that Ralph Lowell established, we were able to launch that project. So I'm deeply grateful and honored to be here to give the lecture in honor of Ralph Lowell. Our civic life isn't going very well. What passes for public discourse consists mainly of shouting matches, where politicians and partisans shout past one another without really listening, ideological food fights on the floors of Congress and on cable television, to say nothing of what goes on in social media. And so the question before us tonight is how did we arrive at this condition? What are the sources of the deepening frustrations, even anger, with democracy, with the project of self-government? Why are we so deeply polarized? And what might we do about it? So are you ready to explore, to figure this out here together tonight? All right. To begin, there are two sources of democracy's discontent that have gone back decades and that pre-existed the arrival of Donald Trump. This is important to recognize. One source is a sense among most American citizens that the project of self-government is slipping from our grasp, that people don't have a meaningful say in shaping the forces that govern our lives. So a sense of disempowerment, that's one source of the discontent. And a second source is the worry that community is eroding, that from family to neighborhood to nation, the moral fabric of community, our sense of belonging, is eroding. And this is deeply dislocating. So the sense that self-government is slipping from our grasp, the sense of disempowerment, that our voice doesn't matter, and that we are unmoored, that the sense of belonging that people aspire to and that democracy requires. These are the two deep sources, I think, of the discontent that has afflicted democracy for some time. Now, to see how these sources of frustration have hardened and turned into anger and have set us apart, we have to look at how our economic life and our social life have unfolded over the past 4 or 5 decades. Because for decades, the divide between winners and losers has been deepening, poisoning our politics, setting us apart. This has partly to do with the growing inequalities of income and wealth brought about by the age of market-driven or neoliberal globalization. But it's not only that. The inequality, the economic inequality, has been compounded, as if to add insult to injury, by growing inequalities of social recognition and esteem, honor, dignity and respect, to the point where a great many working people, those left behind during the age of globalization, feel that their work isn't valued, the dignity of their work is not honored, and that elites, especially credentialed elites, look down on them. It's one thing to feel that one's access to the fruits of prosperity is unequal, being left behind economically. That gives rise to a sense of injustice. But it's something even more galling to feel that at the same time, elites look down. The dignity of work is eroded, that the contributions that people make, especially those without college degrees, aren't valued by the wider society. The discontent that that gives rise to is not just a sense of unfairness and injustice, but also a sense of humiliation, which is an even more potent source of political grievance. How did this happen? Since the 1980s and the 1990s, governing elites carried out a neoliberal globalization project that did bring substantial economic gains, almost all of which went to the top 20%, and almost none of which went to the bottom half. The average wage of the median worker in real terms has been flat, stagnant, for 5 decades, even as globalization delivered very considerable economic growth to the winners. Now, at the time, we were told by the proponents of this economic project that the gains to the winners could be used to compensate globalization's losers. You remember that? But the compensation never arrived. Instead, the winners used their bounty to buy influence in high places and to consolidate their winnings. Government ceased to be a counterweight to concentrated economic power. Democrats and Republicans joined in deregulating Wall Street, reaping handsome campaign contributions. And when the financial crisis of 2008 brought the system to the brink, they spent billions to bail out the banks, but left ordinary homeowners to fend for themselves. Now, there was a response, there was a reaction, a kind of backlash from both sides of the political spectrum in the aftermath, you remember, of the Wall Street bailout. On the left, there was the Occupy movement, and then Bernie Sanders' surprising strength in 2016. And on the right, there was the Tea Party movement and the election of Donald Trump. But the sense of anger and grievance and injustice that animated those two strands of populist protest persist. They have not been put to rest by the politics of recent years. And so what we find ourselves struggling with today is a way of arriving at a political project, a political agenda that could address the two underlying sources of anger and frustration, the sense of powerlessness and the loss of community. I'd like to suggest, before we finish, some ways of addressing these challenges, to begin to heal or perhaps at least ease the polarization that afflicts us. But to do that, we need to look back to the 1990s, really the heyday of this, the era of this version of globalization. Now, the age of globalization was a heady, triumphalist time. You remember political leaders celebrated the flow of goods and people and capital across national borders, not only for the promise of prosperity that this project represented, but also as an open, cosmopolitan alternative to the parochial, place-bound political economy of the past. And for those who objected that the new fluid arrangements enabled companies to send jobs overseas to low-wage countries with few labor protections, or that moving capital into and out of countries at the click of a mouse could prompt destabilizing financial crises, the proponents had an answer. And their answer was, globalization is inevitable. It's a fact of nature beyond politics. And we saw this on both sides of the political spectrum. It began in a way with Margaret Thatcher's famous line defending her version of free market capitalism. In the 1980s, she said time and again, there is no alternative. What's interesting, though, is that center-left political leaders of the 1990s who succeeded the Reagan-Thatcher period, they reiterated this claim of inevitability. Bill Clinton put it like this: globalization is not something we can hold off or turn off. It is the economic equivalent of a force of nature like wind or water. And his UK counterpart, the Labour Prime Minister, Tony Blair, saw globalization as being as unalterable as the seasons. I hear people say we have to stop and debate globalization, he declared. You might as well debate whether autumn should follow summer. Now, although its proponents depicted globalization as a force beyond human control, it actually did require that governments enact quite an extensive list of contestable economic policies. But what's striking for our purpose in tracing the source of the sense of disempowerment is how it asserted through this picture of inevitability the idea that the fundamental shape of the economy is not a subject for democratic citizens to debate. It's really something, if it's a force of nature, then it's really for experts and technocrats to work out how we bend our policies in order to adapt to what is in any case inevitable. And this sense that technocrats and experts can tell us how best to adapt to forces that are fundamentally beyond political debate, that's an important source of the hollowing out of democratic public discourse. Because what is left for citizens to argue about if not the fundamental shape and direction of the economy? Now, already, despite the heady times, the Berlin Wall had fallen, there seemed to be peace and prosperity, liberal democratic capitalism seemed to have prevailed, the only system left standing. Despite this triumphalist hubris, we could call it in retrospect, there were lurking beneath the surface, there were already signs of worries about the loss of self-government and the erosion of community. And at the heart of the predicament was I think people sensed that self-government requires political institutions to hold economic power to democratic account. And it also requires that citizens identify sufficiently with one another to consider themselves engaged in a common project. But today, both of these conditions of healthy democratic life are in doubt. Fast forward to the present. To revitalize American democracy, we need to debate two questions that the market fundamentalist and technocratic politics of recent decades has obscured. First, how can we reconfigure the economy to make it amenable to democratic control? And second, how can we reconstruct our social life and our civic life to ease the polarization and to enable Americans to become effective democratic citizens? Now, the discontents that I've just described, the sense of disempowerment, and the sense of especially those without degrees feeling looked down upon. By 2016, these inchoate discontents had hardened into pretty severe sense of grievance. 4 decades of finance-driven globalization had brought inequalities of income and wealth not seen since the 1920s. From 1980 to 2016, the richest 1% of Americans had doubled their share of national income and now made more than the bottom half combined. Wage stagnation, job loss, the hollowing out of industrial communities, especially in the Midwest and other places in the United States, these were demoralizing in themselves. But the growing inequality was also corrosive of democracy in 2 ways. First, it led to a rigging of the system, as those on top used their wealth to capture the institutions of representative government. And we all know how the Supreme Court opened the way to unlimited campaign contributions. That's a familiar story about one effect of the inequality. But there's also a second. The widening economic inequalities promoted a way of thinking about success and contribution that added insult to the injury of economic inequality. Let me explain what I mean by that, because that's less familiar and less evident a source of the anger and frustration than the familiar oligarchic capture of representative government. And it goes right to the divide between winners and losers. In recent decades, those who've landed on top have come to believe that their success is their own doing, the measure of their merit, and that they therefore deserve the full bounty the market bestows upon them. And, by implication, that those who struggle, those less successful than themselves, must deserve their fate too. Now, this way of thinking about success arises from a seemingly attractive ideal, the principle of meritocracy, the principle that says, insofar as chances are equal, the winners deserve their winnings. In practice, we know chances are not truly equal. Children born to low-income families tend to stay poor as adults. Despite our faith in upward mobility as part of the American dream, only about 1 in 12 children born to low-income families rises to affluence as an adult. Here's another measure of our failure to live up to the meritocratic principles we profess. Think about university admissions, especially to those highly competitive, selective universities that are the object of such fevered ambition and competition. At places like Harvard and Stanford, there are generous financial aid policies. If your family makes less than $200,000 a year, you now go tuition free. And if your family makes less than $100,000 a year, you get free tuition, room, board, and expenses. That's very generous. And yet, even with these generous financial aid policies, there are more students in these places whose families come from the top 1% than there are students from families in the bottom half of the income scale in the country as a whole. So we don't live up to the meritocratic principles we proclaim. And so you might think, well, the answer is simply to work harder to ensure truly fair equality of opportunity, so that everyone really is brought up to the same starting point in the race. And if we could do that, if only we could do that, it wouldn't be easy, then the race would be fair, and then we would be able to say that the winners deserve their winnings. But is that the case? Would a more perfect meritocracy actually enable us to say that the winners deserve the benefits that flow from their success, that their success is their own doing? Well, no, for a couple of reasons. First, picture a race, a fair race. Everyone starts at the same point, and everyone has had access to good training and good nutrition and good running shoes. It's still pretty predictable who's going to win the race. The most gifted runner. Usain Bolt will win that race. I won't. He will. So is it Usain Bolt's doing that he's a gifted runner? Yes, he trains hard. But he's acknowledged that his friend and training partner, who gets the silver, not the gold, trains harder than he does. So talents and gifts, however hard we work to develop and cultivate them, talents and gifts can't really be said to be our own doing. And if that's true, it's hard to say that the winner, even of the fair race, deserves the winnings. But there's another problem with even a perfect meritocracy, which is that meritocracy has a dark side. The dark side is that it's corrosive of the common good. And the reason it's corrosive of the common good is that it encourages hubris among the winners and humiliation among those who lose out. It encourages the winners to inhale too deeply of their own success, to forget the luck and good fortune that helped them on their way, to forget our indebtedness to those who make our achievements possible. Now, during the age of globalization, the meritocratic ideal served as a kind of moral companion, an ideological rationalization for the widening inequalities of income and wealth. And this was for the following reason. What did the mainstream parties, how did they respond to the widening economic inequalities of those decades? They didn't propose structural alternatives to the economic policies they had put in place, the free market deregulatory policies, a version of globalization. What they offered was something else. They said, if you want to compete and win in the global economy, remember whose contours are fixed. But if you want to compete and win, if you're worried about wage stagnation or job loss, what you should do is go to college and get a degree. What you earn will depend on what you learn. You can make it if you try. I call this the rhetoric of rising. It responded, and this was true not only of free market conservatives, it was also the solution offered by mainstream Democrats as well as Republicans. Those slogans were articulated by politicians, mainstream politicians of both parties, to the point of incantation. It was a response to inequality that offered individual upward mobility through higher education as the solution to inequality. What this bracing advice missed was the insult implicit in it. And the insult was this: if you're struggling in the new economy and you didn't go to college, your failure must be your fault. It's on you, not on us, for the policies we enacted. You didn't do what we encouraged you to do in order to get ahead. Now, don't misunderstand. Encouraging people to go to college is a good thing. Making it possible for those who can't afford it is even better. And I've spent my career in higher education. I'm all for that. But it's a mistake to think that individual upward mobility through higher education is itself an adequate response to inequality, to the structural inequalities of this period. Those of us who spend our days in the company of the credentialed can easily forget a simple fact. Most of our fellow citizens don't have a 4-year college degree. Only about 38% of Americans do. More than 60% do not. So it was folly to create an economy that sets as a necessary condition on dignified work and a decent life a 4-year degree that most people don't have. Not only that, the credentialist prejudices that flowed from the rhetoric of rising and the meritocratic solution, proposed solution to inequality, produced a sense among many working people without degrees that elites looked down on them, concluding that they must deserve their fate. They could have improved themselves. They didn't. So the meritocratic way of thinking about success gained prominence in public discourse from the 80s and the 90s and the early 2000s, even as neoliberal globalization brought widening inequalities. It's as if the winners of globalization wanted more than the winnings. They wanted to believe that they deserved the outsized share of income and wealth that 4 decades of deregulation and financialization and neoliberal economic policies had brought them. And this, I think, is what led us to the populist backlash of 2016, and that continues to fuel many, not all, many of the grievances to which right-wing populist figures, not only in the US, but also in other democracies, exploit. One of the deepest divides in politics today is between those with and without a college degree. The diploma divide goes a long way toward explaining, I think, the source of the polarization. Seeing meritocratic ways of thinking about success as the moral rationale and companion for finance-driven globalization helps us understand the backlash. Because for 4 decades, the market faith and the meritocratic rationale taken together formed the defining project of mainstream American politics. One way of putting it is this: neoliberal capitalism made some people rich and others poor. But the credentialism of the meritocratic conviction created the divide. That's what created the divide between winners and losers. That's the divide that's about not only economic inequality, but also about inequality of esteem, recognition, honor, dignity. Now, what might we do about it? Well, we should get over the assumption that the basic terms of economic life are facts of nature beyond human control. We should reconsider the claim by proponents of this version of globalization to depict the economic arrangements they brought into being as facts of nature. And we see this, too, in much discussion today of technology. It's just a fact of nature, and that robots are coming for our jobs. That's just how technology works, and we just have to adapt to it. Maybe by buying off the people whose jobs are taken over by robots with a universal basic income, and that's that. But what that misses is that work is more than a way of making a living. It's a source of meaning. It's a way of contributing to the economy and to the common good, and of winning recognition and appreciation and dignity for doing so. If the basic terms of economic life are unalterable facts of nature, then there's very little left for democratic citizens to deliberate about. So we need to push against this shrunken conception of politics. But we also, to contend with the polarization, have to do something else, and that is to rebuild the public realm. One of the most corrosive effects of the widening inequalities of recent decades is that those who are affluent and those of modest means increasingly live separate lives. We live and work and shop and play in different places. We send our kids to different schools. We rarely encounter people from different backgrounds, different walks of life in the course of the day. This isn't good for democracy. Democracy does not require perfect equality, but what it does require is that people from different backgrounds encounter one another, bump up against one another in the course of our everyday lives. Because this is how we learn to negotiate and to abide our differences. And this is how we come to care for the common good. So we hear a lot about building public infrastructure, and that's very important. Roads and airports and trains and the like. But we also need to rebuild the civic infrastructure of a shared democratic life. And that means building class-mixing institutions, building public places and common spaces that bring people together from different backgrounds, that bring people together to encounter a shared democratic life. I'm thinking of the shared experience when I was growing up as a kid going to a baseball game, when although there were some of the box seats were more expensive than the bleacher seats, it was a kind of class mixing experience. This is back in the 1960s. I grew up when I was a kid near Minneapolis, Minnesota, and I went to see the Minnesota Twins play. And going to a ball game, CEOs sat side by side, more or less, with the mailroom clerk. Everyone had to eat the same soggy hot dogs. Everyone had to wait in the same long lines for the restroom. And when it rained, everyone got wet. But they were all rooting for the home team. But then in the 90s and the 2000s, sports stadia changed. And they had luxury skyboxes. And before we knew it, it was no longer true that everyone had to eat those soggy hot dogs and stand in the long lines for the restroom. In fact, it was no longer true even that when it rained, everyone got wet. That wouldn't matter so much if it only happened in sports stadia. But something similar has happened throughout our public life. I call it the skyboxification of American life. And so the affluents secede from public places. Instead of shared, public parks, public recreation areas, municipal swimming pools, public libraries, public transportation, increasingly, we think of the public domain as a set of services that are created for those who can't afford anything better. But that represents the death of the public life. What we need are to design public institutions, whether parks, playgrounds, public transportation, public health facilities, public schools, that are good enough so that everyone will want to take their kids there for a kind of democratic encounter. Maybe send them there for the services, for the open air and the parks, for the good schools, but the result is a democratic encounter where we learn from one another. And that's what we're missing, which brings us back in a way to public television. And because part of what's missing now with our impoverished public discourse is we have fewer and fewer platforms for reasoned debate on big civic questions that matter. For the most part, the mainstream media does not provide that. They provide arenas for the shouting matches. Higher education also shares in this responsibility. We need to do a better job of providing the kind of civic education that equips young people to reason together and argue together with mutual respect about fraught ethical questions without a sense of intimidation or shrinking from that. Part of what most frustrates, I think, citizens in democracies generally are the empty, hollow terms of public discourse. Part of the appeal of the market fundamentalist faith was not just that markets deliver prosperity and consumer goods. It's the idea that Markets can decide whose contributions matter most. The labor market will sort that out. And so that'll spare us as democratic citizens from having to engage in debate, messy, contentious debate about how to value various social roles. It is as if we outsourced our moral judgment about how to organize the economy to markets, which are not, after all, value-neutral ways of deciding these matters. We need to reclaim from markets, as democratic citizens, these fundamental questions. Now, I've suggested that individual upward mobility through higher education, desirable though it is not enough, and that may lead you to wonder whether I'm therefore against equality of opportunity. I'm not. Equality of opportunity is an important principle. Upward mobility is a good thing. No one should be held back by poverty or prejudice. But we need to remember that equality of opportunity is a remedial principle. It's not an adequate ideal for a good society, because it doesn't speak, in the end, to what holds us together, which is creating a healthy public discourse and also a healthy public realm. I would like to, I mentioned public broadcasting and the contributions of Ralph Lowell in launching it. The American dream has always been about more than individual upward mobility. It's been about diffusing a culture of learning to everyone, not only those who can score high on SATs and get into a place that offers courses in the subject. That's why public television, public broadcasting are so important. But this was understood even by the person who coined the term the American dream. James Truslow Adams was his name. He coined the term in a book he wrote in the 1930s, in the depths of the Depression. The American dream was partly about the chance to rise, but it wasn't only that. It was also, Adams wrote rightly, about achieving a broad democratic equality of condition. And as an example, he pointed to a public place of learning. The U.S. Library of Congress, he said, is a symbol of what democracy can accomplish on its own behalf. Here's how he put it. As one looks down on the general reading room, one sees the seats filled with silent readers, old and young, rich and poor, black and white, the executive and the laborer, the general and the private, the noted scholar and the schoolboy, all reading at their own library, provided by their own democracy. Adams considered this scene to be a perfect working out in a concrete example of the American dream. The means provided by the people themselves and a public intelligent enough to use them. And he said, if this example can be carried out in all departments of our national life, the American dream would become an abiding reality. He anticipated Ralph Lowell founding educational public television. But we have less and less equality of condition today. The public spaces that gather us together across class and race and ethnicity and faith are few and far between. 4 decades of the economic arrangements that have brought inequalities of income and wealth so pronounced that they've led us away from the public realm. into separate ways of life. And this has fed a politics so poisonous and a partisanship so intense that many now regard marriage across party lines as more troubling than marrying outside the faith. It's little wonder that we've lost the ability to reason together about large public questions or even to listen to one another. The meritocratic assumption is also something we need to reconsider. The assumption that people deserve whatever riches the market bestows on their talents, in the end, makes solidarity and community an almost impossible project. For why do the successful owe anything to the less advantaged members of our society? The answer to this question depends on recognizing that for all our striving, we are not self-made and self-sufficient. A lively sense of the role of luck in life and of our indebtedness can prompt a certain humility. The humility that says, there, but for the grace of God or the accident of birth or the mystery of faith, go I. That could be me. This spirit of humility is a civic virtue we need now. Perhaps it can point us, together with a lively sense of the importance of the public realm, perhaps it can point us beyond this polarized moment and help us find our way to a less rancorous, more generous public life. Thank you very much. Thank you.